to Tipping Spears with Hannah Becker. Today's conversation promises to be an insightful one with a remarkable guest. Whether you're joining us for the first time or you're a regular listener, we're so glad you're here. Our goal is to bring you closer to the innovative leaders and thinkers shaping the future of national security, defense, and technology. And today, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Welton Chang, a U.S. Army veteran, technologist, and entrepreneur. Dr. Chang is co-founder and CEO of Pyrra Technologies. Most recently, he was the first CTO at Human Rights First and founded HRF's Innovation Lab. Prior to joining HRF, Welton was a senior researcher at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, where he led teams and developed technical solutions to address disinformation and online propaganda. Before joining APL, he served for nearly a decade as an intelligence officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency and the U.S. Army, including 2 operational tours in Iraq and a tour in South Korea. He received a PhD and an MA from the University of Pennsylvania, an MA from Georgetown University, and a BA from Dartmouth. Welton, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hannah, it's a pleasure, and it's always good to see you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, so I think we should just kind of start out. Can you tell us where your story began?
Well, let's go back to 9/11. I mean, I think 9/11 was a seminal moment for our country, certainly had a major impact on a lot of folks that we know. I know that it has majorly impacted your life as well. But I felt compelled to serve after watching those events, live on television, and did 2 tours in Iraq. And when I got home from being in Iraq in 2011, I kind of looked around after spending about close to a decade between the Army and DIA and said to myself, maybe it's time to do something different with my life. So started to apply to PhD programs, got into a couple, and wound up going to Penn, where I focused on decision making, kind of studying how people make better decisions. And from that work, I developed a knack for doing data science. And when I was about to graduate and looking around to different places where I could apply my craft, I wound up finding a group of folks at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab who were starting to dive into social media data, disinformation. They had a couple of big elections coming up that following year in the EU and Ukraine and other places. And so I made a decision to join APL. And that's really where the kind of journey starts in terms of how I got into the disinfo work, how I became more of a technologist, right? It was kind of stumbling into it. I just happened to wind up at a lab at Penn that had a major focus on teaching its grad students how to actually code and do data science. And then from there, that technical capability gave me the background to be able to work with the engineering staff and folks at Johns Hopkins to build solutions for the U.S. government to tackle some of these problems that they saw emerging on the social internet. And you can trace a direct line from that work through the work I was doing at Human Rights First, which was focused a lot on hate speech and misinformation, to what we're doing today here in Pyrra, protecting companies, protecting different communities from the kinds of threats that we see evolving on social media today. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So many different sectors. I think it's really, really been quite an adventure. Can you tell us a little bit more about Pyrra? Kind of what you do? Give us some examples of kind of the types of things that y'all work on.
Yeah, we're a threat intelligence company based in Washington, D.C. Our bread and butter is collecting data from social media platforms. We currently pull in data from more than 40 platforms. What that equates to from a number standpoint is something close to 100 million posts every single week that we're able to serve up to our clients. And folks use that data to do a few things. One, protect the people and assets that they care about, whether they be executives in their company, headquarters locations, as well as their brand reputation. That's really been the evolution of social media since the 2016 timeframe is it's become much more distributed. It's not just concentrated on Facebook and Twitter. There are somewhere in the order of 100 plus major sites where people are exchanging their views, sharing their opinions, and oftentimes those opinions impact companies and communities. And so, um, you know, folks are able to use our platform, which has a very robust AI capability, allowing them to sift through all of that data very quickly to identify the content that they care about. Um, yeah, and we work from everyone, you know, different Fortune 1000 companies all the way to research organizations, academic institutions, communications PR firms. Lots and lots of folks need access, a view into this, social world that exists.
Yeah, and that's an environment that is just saturated with data. One thing I thought was so cool about kind of your company was turning that into something that's useful. That's something that someone can make decisions off of.
Yeah, that's the hardest thing, right? Lots of folks use the needle in a haystack analogy. We like to say needles in the needle stack, right? Because we can sift down, given the volume of stuff that we're looking at, you can neck stuff down to maybe 100 things that matter, right? But that's still a stack of stuff that you look through. And really where AI is helpful is finding the right needle in the needle stack.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So I know entrepreneurship is not easy. It's not easy to start a company. Um,
Yes, you know that personally.
personally. So I would love to talk to you if you could give us a little bit of insight into what that journey, that shift. So you went from military, government, academia, and then you made this big leap into entrepreneurship. Can you give us some insight into what prompted that or what that was like? Just kind of some real talk on starting your own business.
I mean, honestly, we got pushed out of the nest, right? We were building this technology inside of human rights first. This was in the 2018 to 2020 timeframe. And the board of HRF, the leadership of HRF, they came to us and they said, look, you all should take this commercial. It's all well and good that you're building this technology for a human rights audience, for a nonprofit audience. But to us, there's real value to this that somebody's actually going to want to pay for. And so initially, and this is the God's honest truth here. I told those folks, I said, I am not the right person to do that. Go hire an actual CEO and I'll be a strategic advisor to them. I want to continue at HRF. I like what I'm doing. And the more and more we looked at how to build the company, how to turn the technology that we had into something that somebody would actually pay for, the more we realized that we had to be the ones to do it. People, there's a lot of discussion, around, hey, if a startup hits a certain level of growth, do you switch CEOs, kind of switch out founders for a professional CEO at some point to take it to the next stage? And I think that the answer to that is it depends, but oftentimes you lose something when a founder leaves because we're the ones that have the initial ideas for how to actually do the thing and execute. So again, stumbling into things, right? And this is something I say to students all the time when people come and ask me for advice. I am not the example that you should be looking at. Maybe you can draw some lessons from my life, but you shouldn't look at my career path and go, I want to model my life on that. Which you look at it and go, this person's been meandering through life since 2001, which is, I think, absolutely true. Um, but I will say that I've had a lot of satisfaction as well because I've been able to work on issues that I think matter to people. And at the end of the day, I can look at what we've done and say we we weren't just out there trying to make a buck. We actually try to do good on some level. So um, that's kind of my journey into entrepreneurship. And I think the other thing I would, if there are other aspiring entrepreneurs out there are so many lessons that you can glean from somebody who's been through it. Um, but on some level, you can only really know by experiencing it. It's kind of like being deployed. You can talk about being deployed, you can listen to people talk about it, you can read books, but until you've done it, it's not something that you can innately know until you've experienced it. And I would argue that's entrepreneurship is a very similar situation.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. Everyone's entrepreneurial journey seems a little different. I love how you emphasize that, eventually you just have to do it and then kind of roll with the punches on it and
Yeah,
figure it
absolutely.
out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So was there a particular event or person that kind of served as a catalyst or inspiration with along your career journey?
You know, I not really. I think what I generally try to do when I think about people that have had an influence on my life, and obviously I wouldn't be here without my parents. So, thanks to them for not screwing me up too bad. Um, but there's lots of folks out there who've done interesting things, and I take little pieces of advice from different people, right? Uh, for example, with the company, one of our early advisors was General Vince Stewart, who was the former director of DIA, Marine officer. Um, I remember when we first started the company and we asked him if he would be willing to join our board of advisors. We didn't know if he was going to say yes or not. And not only did he say yes, but he was really ecstatic about doing it. And fortunately, he passed away suddenly, and we miss his advice on a regular basis. But one of the things that he said to us was like, don't lose your North Star. Like always remember what your mission, what you set out to do. Um, about other folks say things like, I remember Nate Fick, who he probably doesn't even remember this conversation. At the time, he was the president CEO of Center for New American Security. And I remember calling him one day. I was thinking about leaving DIA and going and getting a PhD. And I was asking him for advice, like whether I should do it or not. And at the time, I thought he gave me a pretty kind of roundabout answer. He said, "Hey, one of the things that I look for when I'm hiring, this would have been, man, almost more than a decade ago." He said, "I want to look for diverse people in terms of experiences, right?" Um, and I've really carried that message, I think, as I've gone through. One of the things that I was exposed to at APL was just a range of technologies, from robotics to edge computing, uh, just a whole slew of different capabilities. And it really opened my eyes to what's out there in terms of what we can do. And I've really enjoyed my time at APL. So, shout out for APL. It was a great place to work too. And it's got fantastic people. But the diversity idea also applies to the things that you encounter, right? The information sources that you draw your information from, the kinds of people that you might find interesting and talk to. One of the things I think gets lost in today's world is we're so deep in our phones, right? And you're on an airplane, I think 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you might talk to your neighbor and you might have a conversation that's like super interesting. But we don't do that anymore. And I think that's something that's missing from how we encounter our daily lives, right? We're on rails with our electronics. And I think the more and more we can get our heads out of that and expose ourselves to what's going on around us, the better off we all will be. So yeah, that's another, I guess, piece of advice for the audience. I'm in an
Yeah,
advice giving mood today.
well, you really hit the nail on the head with kind of we've lost touch of the human component. Like one thing I always thought was so cool about your company and the technology that y'all developed and utilized was you are protecting people, you're protecting organizations, you're protecting communities. Those are humans. You're using technology as a tool to do that. But in the tech industry, oftentimes the human component of the problem you're trying to solve is totally lost. And I loved how you tied it into kind of maintaining your basically eyes on the North Star, because you can get bogged down in lots of lines of code. But what are you trying to solve here? What are you trying to fix? That's great advice.
Yeah, and I think it also applies to our online world, right?
Yeah.
And COVID pushed us more and more online, and we've retained a lot of those habits. The online world is not the real world. It's non-representative. It's the loudest voices. It's extreme in a lot of ways, whether that's algorithmically amplified or just the way that people express themselves, or a combination of the two. And you can get lost following just things that are happening online, right? And it goes back to our inability to discern fact from fiction, our inability to connect with one another. It's all rooted in, I was reading at one point, I guess in recent past, most American adults spend more time online in front of a computer than they do without one. Like we reached that tipping
Wow.
point, right? Like waking hours,
Yeah.
in front of their device more than they are in reality. And yeah, you can talk about Ready Player One and like the whole VR world and the metaverse or whatever, but like the reality of it is we're already headed in that direction. Um, and it's just with the two-dimensional object
Mhm.
that you're looking at, or things that you're looking at two-dimensionally on your screen. And that's very worrisome to me. We're losing grip of reality in a very, very subtle way, and we may not realize it until it's too late, where we spend 16 hours a day online and the rest of the time you're spending asleep, right? It's
Yeah.
kind of crazy.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of paradoxical too. It's like this technology is supposed to connect us to each other, and then the effects, which you described beautifully. I've noticed just in myself, the more time I spend online, the more I crave in-person interactions, which is harder than ever to find. Like the disappearance of the third spaces in our society, and people getting together. It's just not something that you described it as subtle, and I think it really is. I think it has snuck up on people. They're not aware that they haven't gone to dinner with friends in months, that they haven't attended a community organization or religious or something in months in person. And yeah, subtle, yet it is also happening so rapidly, which is crazy because usually fast things catch our attention, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, kind of goes back to our psychological sense of what's going on around us, frog and boiling water effect,
Mhm.
creeping normality. There's a lot of different terms for it, all describing the same phenomenon. And you're right, like Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone,
Yes,
that
love
was
that book.
how long ago was that? And
25 years.
we've just continued that, right?
Mhm.
And it was a warning to
It
America
was.
about how that was going to basically fundamentally change the nature of the country, right? And like, Putnam out it took a lot from de Tocqueville,
Mhm.
and these are things that we don't talk about anymore. And we really should, right? It's like should be an innate part of our civic education, and the whole idea of civics and civic spaces and being involved. It's so much easier for us just to tune out and say that's somebody else's responsibility, right? And that's another thing why the veteran community is so important, is because almost all of us, to a person, said at some point, it's not somebody else's responsibility, it's my responsibility, right? But we're almost, and I'm a movie fanatic, so forgive the analogies here. But in Starship Troopers, at least the movie version, a little bit different from Heinlein's book, right? The 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 whole idea of being a citizen and becoming a citizen was centered around this service, and then what happens to them? They realize that, like, actually the kind of world that we signed up for is not the world that we thought it would be, right? Um, and that's a lot of parallels to what we're experiencing today. And I think, you know, one of the things that we need to do to kind of bring everybody back together, and I don't even know if it's possible at this stage, given how things are progressing around the country, but like we just need to interact with people more, and get out of these online spaces and just talk to normal people, and stop retweeting crazy stuff, right? And garbage, divisive things, right? And that's not even, and I know you and other folks that you work with have talked about this, but like our foreign adversaries are trying to amplify these differences so that this, the strength of the American democracy is degraded over time, right? They don't want us to be strong. And I think the strength of the country comes from our ability to set aside our differences and to recognize that um, it doesn't matter that somebody else is some other thing. They live in their lives, right? And you're living your life. And there are things that we can come together on and agree on that don't have to do with, um, all these different political extremes and polarized ideas that divide us, right? But there's so much more, we have so much more in common with one another than we do, differences. So yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know if this is where you want to take the podcast, but that's what I felt like talking about today. So
Yeah,
yeah.
no, that's great. I love how you mentioned kind of people view, the effects of technology. That's not their responsibility, right? That's, the platforms caused it, all this bigger stuff, but the consequences of us doing this, that's ours to bear, right? Like, which you described beautifully, like how it's impacting the communities. And I know you've been doing some work specifically with kind of the veteran community in mind in terms of online activity. Can you kind of share a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, I think it's a real cause for concern, and I'm hoping that there are folks in your audience that will resonate with this. But the fact that an active duty special forces um, senior NCO, a team sergeant, committed suicide in front of the Trunk Hotel and left behind um, some writings that I think people should look at that and analyze it, understand what Sergeant Livelsberger actually believed up until the moment of his death. And the New Orleans attacker, right? It's not lost on people that both of those folks had some connections to the military, be it veteran or active duty. And on some level, involvement of veterans, active duty folks in the January 6th attack on the Capitol, being a part of the vanguard, right? We're talking Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, Three Percenters. That ultimately is going to change how the American population views the veteran community, right? For a long time, I think people were rightly concerned about. There's two narratives about military. One is they're all heroes. Everybody's on a pedestal, which I think everybody in your audience, anybody who served, man, it's a cringe fest when somebody comes up to you and shakes your hand and says, thank you for your service. Like, well, how do you respond to that, right? And a lot of times you just kind of say, thank you for, I don't know. It's so hard to respond to that because honestly, we all signed up for it, right? And then um, the other narrative is we're all broken. We all have PTSD. Uh, we, are all unhinged from our service and we hate the government, right? And you can extrapolate from that. And so what is the reality? The reality is we are a cross section of America. We all have, many of us have vastly different opinions from one another. We're not a monolith. Um, but there is something to be said about the fact that we were overrepresented in the crowd that attacked the Capitol. We were overrepresented in the crowd, especially the folks who did violent things on that day and were prosecuted for it. And then we're, you know, they're highly prominent recent acts of violence that involve us. And we have to ask ourselves, like, why is this, right? And if you look at what the New Orleans attacker was saying, and obviously that person self-radicalized with a lot of online stuff as well, right? A lot of this, it goes back to what kind of information we're ingesting on a regular basis. And again, if you don't have that connection to the real world, if you're not talking to people who are quote unquote normal, you're going to spin yourself up into a frenzy. And eventually, one of the potential outcomes is what you saw in these extreme acts. So, I think it should be worrying to the military veteran community how much this is happening. And, some of the responsibility falls on us, right? The whole idea of like your battle buddy, folks that you serve with, staying connected to them, just checking in on them, see how they were doing, right? And I think there were attempts to try to make Sergeant Livelsberger's, some of the things that he was experiencing, like get him help, right? But we need to do more of that. The community has to be on some level of self-policing, but we also need to recognize that like some of this is happening beneath our noses, and we need to kind of wake up to it and get more involved. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening that is internal to the community, and then like I said earlier, that you've written about, our foreign adversaries look at what's going on and go, I have an in here, right? I was just presenting down in Dallas with Catherine Keneally, who's at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And one of the videos that Catherine plays is a Russian propaganda video designed to make Afghanistan veterans feel like their sacrifice wasn't worth it. And that, I think, is a feeling that is valid. But the way that it's presented in the video, it is pure Russian propaganda to divide us. So again, separating things that are organic from things that somebody is intending for you to see in order to achieve some political outcome, right? Again, it's harder and harder to do because of how much we are online, but recognizing that like our enemies are trying to do this to us. And we on some level have to resist it in a way, similar to how we harden ourselves from ransomware attacks and some of the other, cybersecurity dangers out there, but it's to protect our mind instead of our computer.
Yeah, well, you brought up a great point that I think most people, at least most people that I talk to, are not aware of, is kind of the foreign adversary agenda, the influence, and then it's basically targeting of members of the military and veteran community. So that's really good insight. I think it's just kind of, again, lost in all the information, the bombardment that people are receiving.
Yeah. We are targets. We are targets because we still, even though it's slightly on decline in terms of how most Americans perceive the military in a positive way, we're still one of the most trusted institutions in and groups of people in the country. And so what better way to achieve high levels of returns on investment in terms of your disinformation efforts than to target a group that if you were to convert them into your perspective, they will transmit that information to their communities who trust them more. It just makes sense from a tactical targeting perspective that they would target our demographic.
Yeah. So I know kind of We think about your kind of career journey through multiple different sectors and some fascinating work. Yeah, all of that could not have just, all come together magic wand style. I know it wasn't all super easy. Can you tell us about maybe some of like the biggest obstacles you faced on your career journey and how you overcame those, what strategies you used?
Oh, wow. I mean, so many obstacles. It's kind of almost impossible to count. Um, but I think I will say that one of the things to keep in mind is, if not you, then who? There's a scene in Zero Dark 30 where I think it was the CI director come in and start talking to the Bin Laden cell. And the gist of it is, you think there's another floor full of analysts that are doing this work? No, we're it. And a lot of the times, if an entrepreneur does not take their idea to fruition, it's never going to happen. And this is something I've emphasized a lot to other founders that I talk to is the idea of execution risk, right? Oh, that person's at execution risk, or there's execution risk involved in this endeavor. There's always execution risk, right? Execution risk is, are you going to get up tomorrow and put your foot in front of the other foot and continue to carry that heavy rucksack, or are you going to give up? And I think that's another thing that sets apart, you know, veteran entrepreneurs specifically from somebody who does maybe hasn't had that similar experience is you can draw on that well of, yeah, 4 o'clock in the morning at Fort Huachuca when it was already, 90 degrees outside. And as the sun's coming up, it's going to be like 110. And you're carrying a 45-pound sack on your back and you're trying to do it under 3 hours time limit, right? Like you can draw on that well of experience and know that you've done that before and know that this too also shall pass. Um, I think that's a huge thing to remember is you might see an obstacle, it might seem insurmountable, and give it your effort. And what do you have to lose, right? I think that's another piece of this is that um, we we look at something and go, well, maybe I shouldn't try that because I might fail. Well, you're gonna fail 100% of the time. What's the Michael Scott quote, right? So quoting Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take, right? That is no more true in entrepreneurship than it is anywhere else. Because again, if you don't do it, somebody else is probably not going to do it. They may have the same idea as you, right? And this is what happens a lot of the time, right? Like you get all these companies that start up around the same time, that have similar ideas, but ultimately it's about who can execute better. That becomes the winner. And execution is 100% about just putting up with the pain and getting it done when you don't want to, right? And I think about that a lot of like, this is something I don't want to do. I don't want to go and file corporate taxes. I don't want to go and you know do this very, very complicated paperwork thing, but I have to do it in order to get this thing done, right? And that's what um I think folks should focus on when they're at the part of their entrepreneurship journey and think, man, I can't do this.
Yeah, there's certainly no shortage of good ideas, but like massive shortage of folks that will factually follow through on it and do the work that's required. At least in my own entrepreneurial experience, I'm very optimistic. So when I start something, I'm like, oh, I underestimate the amount of time it's going to take by like multiple years. And so you're putting one foot in front of the other analogy is spot on. Just keep it going. So I know throughout your career, kind of a theme has been kind of defense and national security, which that sector is always changing, and it's also very complex. So what we did even in response to 9/11 may not be what's going on, now. Can you kind of tell us what developments, whether that's technological or strategy in national security, what new things excite you, and then what new things kind of scare you, kind of what you're focusing on now, kind of what those topics are.
Yeah, I mean, what's really interesting is almost everyone's answer to that question is going to somewhat revolve around AI, because AI is the dominant force that everyone's talking about in every industry. But I think one sub element of AI is robotics, and specifically, UAVs, and the edge computing that is appearing on these platforms more and more, making them more and more capable. And I think we're underestimating how much of a shift that is going to be in how we fight. Um, you know, I saw, I think it was a press release from the Army, and they were, as part of basic training, teaching um, trainees how to fly UAVs, specifically the quadcopter. It's a little tricky sometimes, uh, but that's like the tip of the iceberg, right? One person flying one quadcopter is eventually going to turn into one person flying a fleet of like 100 quadcopters that can all coordinate amongst themselves in order to achieve objective. Um, and what, but the reasoning behind it and why, and is simple mathematics. It's a lot cheaper to build a quadcopter than it is to recruit, train, house, feed um, a soldier. So how do you make that soldier a platform? Um, you know, and then amplify that soldier's capabilities on the battlefield. And that's extending them via all these different robotic capabilities that are out there. So, I really think between like exoskeletons and pack carrying robotics to the UAV piece, future warfare, if we wind up fighting, one of these major battles, and we see a lot of it, kind of evolving in Ukraine, but it's going to be that multiplied by 10, 20, 100, right? It's just not going to look the same. It's kind of the same. It's so funny. There was this concept of revolutionary military affairs in the early 2000s. We wound up fighting a very, very different conceptual war in Iraq and Afghanistan from what people thought, like high-tech warfare, right? And I think we're going to get a similar combination of that in future warfare, where it is dirty and grimy. It's still involving folks on the ground, you know, buried deep in trench lines, right? But it's also going to involve extremely high tech, you know, satellite piloted, non-line of sight, hundreds of UAVs coordinating their actions to take out, incoming um, squadron of tanks, right? Things like that. It's the kind of warfare that I think we haven't seen yet, and that we probably will see in the future. And that's what should be motivating, how we design our forces today, and think about what our kind of future capability requirements look like. Which is very hard, right? Because like, what's the thing that keeps a lot of people employed? The F-35, the F-22, and these giant ships and all this other stuff. But the reality of warfare is going to look very different from, the things that those things were designed for. Not saying that we should abandon our investment in those things, because those things are obviously needed for, things like deterrence, and also to counter, other conventional threats. But we need to be investing on both lines, I think, because that's, the reality of future warfare is happening in Ukraine, and that's everything is pointing that direction right now.
Yeah, there's an old saying that we're ready for the war we just fought.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's great to kind of hear your thoughts on the future of warfare, and it's that combination being something that's unique, and then kind of getting that preview with what is happening. So are there any career resources or resources, books, TED Talks, anything that you found really helpful as you went on this career journey that you would recommend for folks?
I got a couple. I don't think I've ever plugged Angela. So Angela Duckworth was one of my committee members for my dissertation. And Angela is very well known for her work on grit, which the seminal study for grit actually happened at West Point. So she has written a book about it, but if you want the condensed version, you can always watch her TED Talk, which is one of the most watched TED Talks I think ever. I was always intimidated by that when I ran into her in the hallways. The talk as a person was like the most watched TED Talk ever. Yeah, and then there is a book. Here, let me see if I have it up here. Here it is. It's called Venture Deals for any aspiring entrepreneurs out there. The kind of tagline for the book is like, be smarter than your lawyers. Honestly, that's another thing, is that what you don't realize going into becoming a founder or CEO of a startup is you're going to get a real education in legal, and you're going to essentially get an MBA on the fly. And that book is very helpful in understanding some of the more tricky aspects of the legal side of getting stood up as a company, what things you have to do to properly fundraise so that you don't have issues in the future. It's another thing I talk to founders about, is like not incurring that sort of administrative debt early on. Do things the right way, spend the money where you have to spend it in order for you not to have issues in the future. Because, the more corners you cut early on, the worse it is going to be for you when you ultimately have to go back and undo all of that stuff.
Yeah. Well, do you have any kind of, I know you've given us so much great advice throughout this episode, but do you have any kind of final advice for folks that are interested in starting their own business, or, a career in the military or national security, that you'd like to leave the audience with?
Find the right people to do it with. I was very lucky to have two incredible co-founders, Beck Jones, Eric Kerwin. Eric's another military veteran, West Pointer. Beck's former Australian intelligence, like, couldn't have gotten to this point without them. And you're not always going to see eye to eye on things, but you have to have some level of trust there so you can get through those periods. And it's so enormously important to have folks in your corner as you're going along this journey, right? Like, being a solopreneur, I think, is one of the hardest things that you can do. And the more help you get, the more you're able to find other people with expertise that outstrips your own, that it's going to make your life so much easier. So that's another, I guess, parting shot I've got for the audience.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your expertise. Your contributions to the world of national security and technology are incredibly impactful. And I know we've learned so much from your perspective.
Well, thank you, Hannah. Thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure. I always love talking about these topics, so I hope the audience feels the same way.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Tipping Spears with Hannah Becker. We hope this conversation has sparked new ideas and challenged the way you think about our future. So don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, and we will catch you next time with an exciting guest.